Hello, and a very warm welcome to you in an increasingly chilly time of year. My name is Matt Stadler. I'm a regular host here at the How To Academy, former LBC and BBC presenter and former Telegraph columnist. You can find me on Radio 5 Live and Channel 5 these days. And I'm in Wales, and we don't have much internet at my parents' place. So I'm coming to you from above a spa shop in a tiny Welsh town. And I hope the internet holds. I'm delighted to introduce to you a man of international renown, the author of 6 books now, Professor of Psychology at Toronto University, Professor Paul Bloom, and he's written a new book, The Sweet Spot, and that's what we're going to be talking largely about this evening. If you have questions that you wish I'd asked, you can of course do that, get involved digitally towards the end. Paul, very good to see you.
Thanks for having me here, Matt.
Start please at the beginning. Why this book?
I was always interested in certain puzzles, certain weird pleasures we get, like hot baths and saunas, horror movies, BDSM, self-harm. And why do people get pleasure from this? Why does it do stuff for them? And so I wrote a book. I started to sort of explore this. I was going to call my book The Pleasures of Suffering. And then as I wrote it, I realized that its scope has to be broader. There's a lot of suffering we choose that is of value to us, that makes a difference, that isn't in the service of pleasure, but maybe gives us meaning or morality. So I ended up exploring and talking about the role that suffering plays in a life well lived. And to me, that's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, I think we should point out right from the beginning that at no point do we want to encourage people to suffer, particularly not in the context of mental health. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be exploring this relationship between pleasure and pain.
Yeah, I mean, we want to encourage people to do some sort of suffering. I wouldn't discourage somebody from taking on a triathlon or eating, spicy curry or raising children. But yeah, we don't want unnecessary suffering. We don't want unchosen suffering. We want the right kind of suffering.
We don't want self-harm, in other words. But that
definitely don't want self-harm.
That doesn't mean, again, that it's not interesting to explore the psychology of it. How much of your thinking about pleasure and pain, suffering and happiness, and the relationship between them is rooted in the classics? Because if you think back to the Epicureans, they had a certain vision of what living a happy life involved. You think about Socrates, He too had a vision. You had the Epicureans, as I say, you had a whole range of different approaches. Aristotle had an approach. Socrates thought you had to be poor. Aristotle thought you had to be rich and, I guess, ideally healthy, and so forth. And then you had people who were hedonists, who thought that the happiness was all about basically the pursuit of almost pure pleasure. How much of your understanding of the psychology of this area is rooted 2,000 or so years ago?
Most psychologists who have thought about this, including me at the beginning, were just accepted hedonist view. We thought pleasure, happiness, they were interchangeable. Pleasure is the source of a good life. And when I originally wrote the book, started on it, dealing with questions like spicy foods and horror movies, I was sort of interested from that perspective. And then I found, as I thought about it, and I should have thought about this earlier in my life, but that framework's pretty inadequate. There's a lot of other things we want. I end up converging on what you call motivational pluralism. You want many things. You want pleasure, yeah, but also you want meaning, you want morality, you want purpose. And then I went back and read all the people I should have known about in the first place, from Socrates to Christian and Buddhist thought, all which really recognize that a good life contains some degree of suffering and pain and difficulty.
Are we all consciously, do you think, motivationally pluralistic?
It's a really good question. I think we sometimes delude ourselves into thinking that we're just hedonists. I've had conversations with people. I know this guy is an incredibly sweet guy. He does favors for everybody. He's a real mensch. And he insists he's just motivated by pleasure. I do it because I like it. And I said, really? Like, the reason why you help people is because you get a buzz from it? Absolutely. And I think it's just self-delusion. I think people who tell themselves that they love their children, that they love their children just because it gives them a buzz when things go well and an ache when things go badly, are in this weird hallucination about their own mental states. I think most of us are aware, have the feel that some things we do for fun. It's a hot day and I reach for a cool drink and all I want is that feeling. Some things we do because we feel right. And sometimes we do it because we want to, we want to do something significant. We want to have a purpose in life. So I don't think motivational pluralism is that alien to us. I think it's accessible to consciousness, but there's some people who work very hard to deny it.
Why do we do so many things in the pursuit of pleasure that we know in one part of our brain are bad for us? Take, for example, a very simple thought, unprotected sex, or taking a dangerous drug. I mean, all drugs are dangerous to different degrees and for different people, but you catch my drift.
Yeah. There's a time horizon issue. So unprotected sex, for the most part, feels pretty good. The argument against it is in the future, but we discount the future, and we should discount the future. Like what's happening right now matters more than what should happen a year from now or 2 years from now, because you could die, things could change. It makes sense to be present oriented. The problems arise when we're too present oriented, and this shows up both as individuals. We could have unprotected sex, running terrible risks later on. You eat fatty and delicious food because it tastes good, even though you're going to pay for it later on in your life. And also the societal level, things like climate change, for instance, are basically, I don't want to suffer now for much greater good in the future. And we're both present oriented as individuals, but also as a society and also as a political system. So we choose, psychologists talk about a marshmallow test, where you're offered one marshmallow now or two later. We often grab at the marshmallow now.
Socrates, Plato's mouthpiece, had something to say about this time horizon thing, didn't he? Because he was able to describe the idea that something that is immediately before you can appear a greater good than something further down the line.
Yes, and this is a source of great individual differences. Some people have, we call it willpower, we call it temporal discounting. Some people are very good at not indulging in the thing right now if it would cause them greater harm. Some people are very bad at it. And this tends to be more or less a personality-wide characteristic. The same person who engages in unprotected sex is the person who's likely to smoke, is the person who's likely to take dangerous drugs, is the person who's likely not to save money for the future. On the other hand, you can imagine, just to be fair, if you could go too far. There are people who deny themselves all sorts of pleasures now in the hopes of getting a better future. And you could spoil yourself of a lot of life that way. I try not to put the title of my book in everything, but here there really is a sweet spot, the right amount of temporal discounting to do.
You begin your book by talking about your son. And one of the things he does, apart from getting himself into situations that you might associate with pain, but he actually enjoys, is climbing Everest, not literally, but as part of his schooling. So every day he'd climb a certain height, and he'd then map out and work out on a virtual chart where he'd be on Everest at that time. And this was hard work, but of course it was pleasure-inducing as well. It was painful. Did you hear that?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. So I tell the story, and I had my son's permission. My kids are in my books, but they're when they were very young, and I wrote books on language development, I put them in the books without permission. But now, as they get older, they could get embarrassed by me. But I like the story, and the one way I'll describe it in a little bit of a different way was, I'm not sure it was pleasure. He actually found the daily climbs in the rock gym up and down the mountain to get the equivalent of Everest often boring, painful. Sometimes he said, I wish I didn't do this. But it was a project that had meaning for him. Not as much meaning if he actually climbed Everest, but it was a big project. It was a challenge. It required regular work. And I think that sort of satisfaction is both different from pleasure, but also is a value to us. And I think everybody could think of some things that they do that don't give them pleasure in a straightforward sense, but it's as a sort of means to an end, and that sort of satisfying a bigger goal.
There's a relationship, of course, between effort and reward, between effort and the pleasure one gets from reward. So we might profoundly enjoy the chocolate meringue, fluffy cream, hazelnut ice cream, hot chocolate sauce tower that I had at my favorite restaurant in central London last night. But the pleasure one gets from that is temporally limited. The pleasure I got from my university degree, given that the entirety of my education was in one sense building up to that moment of aspirational achievement, is something that has lasted throughout my adult life, coming and going. It gives a deep lying satisfaction. We know that, don't we? It's not a complicated psychological fact about most of us.
We know that. I talk in my book about how I trained to run a marathon and ultimately ran it. And it took me like a year to get into shape to do it. And it was difficult and unpleasant and full of injuries and blisters and all that good stuff. And I ran, it was horrible. At the end, I ran it, but I finished the damn thing. And that gave a source of satisfaction. I have friends who are in excellent shape. And, every once in a while you hear about somebody who, had a long night at the bar and they sit down and say, I want to run a marathon tomorrow. And they do. And they might do well, but it's not going to have the satisfaction of somebody working for it. It's one theory, by the way, the way you're talking about the relation between effort and value, of why this amazing world we have of entertainment doesn't please us more. So I have, and you have, and everybody has a machine that could play through streaming video just about any movie I would ever want to see, any musical, any song, any composer I'd want to hear. But the problem is it's so easy. You just boop, 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 and then you're listening to it. And the easiness robs it of its satisfaction.
And there's an argument to be made, and I'm not someone who denies the beauty or the brilliance of watching movies, films, but the effort that is required in reading a good book,
yes,
can give a deeper level of satisfaction than watching a good film, I would argue, and there'll be plenty who disagree, but the reason I'd argue that is because more is being asked of me as a reader. I am being asked, there's a greater gap between the author and the reader than perhaps there is between the director or the screenwriter and the viewer. I'm being asked to work, I'm being asked to fill in gaps, I'm being asked to bring my own experiences to that experience.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, you could say there's some movies that ask that of you, but for the most part, movies, TV, it's kind of passive. You sit on your sofa, you put on Netflix, and then just the time goes by. And what you're talking about sounds like what this guy Csikszentmihalyi, who sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago, describes as flow, which is there's a deep satisfaction in something which is so difficult that you're not bored, you're engaged, but not so difficult that you're in a state of anxiety. It's in this sort of middle space. And reading a good book is that feeling. It gives you a feeling of satisfaction and engagement.
Sum up his book for us about flow, if you can.
Oh, this is a wonderful book. He was interested in what people find rewarding and satisfying. And he started off by saying, well, I guess maybe it's pleasure. Everybody's first answer. And he did all of these clever studies finding that people think vacations are fun and work is boring, work is unpleasant. But when you actually test them by sort of randomly asking different times a day, people are often happier at work if their job is satisfying and difficult than they are at vacations, which are kind of often boring and stressful. And he began to think of this notion of flow. And the definition of a flow state that I like best is you're in a flow state if time goes by. You forget to eat, you forget to pick up the kids at school, you're just lost in it. And he says, and he, through example after example, said, a life well lived is a life full of flow. He tells these stories of these rock climbers and these professional musicians and these mathematicians and poets losing themselves in flow for hours at a time.
This is something I describe in my book about bird watching. It's for me a kind of meditative experience where you see a bird when you're out in a wood in the early morning with the sunlight coming through the trees. And at first, it doesn't appear to be very busy up there in the canopy. And then you see this one bird, tiny bird, and it leads you to another bird, and that leads you to another. And suddenly, or soon, you are immersed in this avian world. You lose, as much as is possible, perhaps, this sense of self. And you are as connected to your natural environment as maybe you can be. And you are in this position of flow. And that's a very profound pleasure. It's such a pleasure that perhaps we don't even realize we're experiencing the pleasure as we experience it. I mean, another analogy might be, and of course what I'm about to say is famously pleasurable, but making love, when you are actually making love and not just doing sex, but making love, connected with that other person, you're in a moment of flow. And there are times when we get you talk about the sweet spot, it's the title of your book. There are times when we've got that sweet spot, because we might be skiing, if we're fortunate enough to go on a skiing holiday, we might be skiing down a mountain, and we have to be just sufficiently preoccupied with not tripping over, falling over and dying, that we lose all the stresses of our everyday life because we have to be in that moment. And that can be hugely pleasure inducing, even though it requires some effort and some engagement to perform the task.
That's a perfect description. And the qualification is true that you make at the end, which is it requires some work. So you ask people, and Csikszentmihalyi has done the studies, we ask people, how much flow do you experience in your life? Some people say none, zero, because it takes some work to get into it. It takes some, for the bird watching, you got to know stuff. You got to focus. Maybe in some level, you might just want to walk through the woods, just simpler. You have to take the steps to pull yourself up into this state. And the world conspires against that. Social media does, your smartphone does. Your smartphone is the enemy of flow. Your smartphone will want you to look at it and get lost in it and not engage at a level of difficulty. But when you do it, it's the best thing ever. And you're right, sex could be a source of flow. Good conversation could be a source of, you're talking to somebody, and then, all this time goes by, you don't realize how quickly it's happened.
I know our audience will be curious to have your take on Viktor Frankl's work, because it's something else that has influenced you and has gripped you in this context.
Yes. That is a book. I read two books when I was young that really shaped me. And that Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is the other one. And the subtitle of my book, The Search for Meaning, is a kind of a shout out to Frankl. So Frankl, as people, I think for many people know the story, but he was in Austria during the Holocaust, and he didn't want to leave. He had plenty of warning. He didn't want to leave his parents. Ended up going to the camps, I think Dachau and Auschwitz. And before he was in the camps, his job, he was a psychiatrist, and he was interested in suicide. And so what he did was he did a sort of scholarly informal study asking what distinguishes those who kill themselves in the camps, either through neglect or through actively killing themselves, from those who try to make it through. And he said it's nothing as simple as good cheer, personality, extroversion. It's if you have a meaning. He says, there's some sort of quote that says, somebody who has a why in their life can make it through almost any how. And so he then built a philosophy, a psychiatric method built on the idea that we're not just hedonists, we also want meaning, and the meaning holds our life together. And this was a very powerful thought for me.
While we're on meaning, and since you bring up Austrian Jews, I just want to mention my own grandparents, because they were Jewish emigres, Jewish refugees from Vienna. And I want to connect it to something else you talk about in the book, which is this cliched phrase. You point out that most of us have said it probably, or if you Google it, it's everywhere. That's everything happens for a reason. And this is a way of people trying perhaps to understand suffering, and possibly connects to post-traumatic growth, which you also discuss. I look back at my grandparents and I remember them saying, or being told that they would say, and of course they didn't mean this, they were better than most fully aware of the horrors of the Holocaust, but in a lighter moment they would thank Hitler, because as a consequence of Hitler they escaped anti-Semitism in Vienna. My grandmother, for example, asked for a test tube in her chemistry class in her Viennese university and was told, "Not for you, comrade," in other words, "Not for you, you Jew." And they came to England, where they were welcomed and treated with respect. Now, although they didn't mean it literally, although they weren't really grateful to Hitler, maybe there is a seed in there of trying to make sense of something as horrific as being ripped from your home and from your homeland.
The focus on my book is on chosen suffering, but you're raising unchosen suffering. And I think just as chosen suffering is often an expression of autonomy and purpose and a life well lived, we take unchosen suffering, which is just bad stuff that happens to us, the Holocaust or somebody you love dies, you're violently assaulted. And we try to instill meaning to it. We sort of try to reverse engineer it. I think this is what religions do. A lot of what goes behind religions is the idea that everything happens for a reason. There's no such thing as mere, stuff happens, but rather there's a logic to everything. And what you're talking about to your grandparents is in some way an example of what Dan Gilbert calls the psychological immune system, which is when bad stuff happens, we're often very good at telling a story that it all happened for a reason. Now, I think we should be cynical, and I think everything happens for reasons often a very cruel philosophy. You apply it to other people. Well, you got cancer? Well, let's figure out why.
It spills into blame, right?
Pardon me?
It spills into blame.
Definitely. It spills into blame. It spills into sort of a comfort with the status quo, saying, well, a lot of people poor, suffering, sick, unfortunate, but in the end, it's all going to work out. Don't you worry yourself about it. And I think a mature way of thinking about it says sometimes bad stuff happens, just random stuff or human malevolence, and we should try to get better and try to recover from it. But the storytelling just isn't true. But on the other hand, I don't doubt that the storytelling does sometimes serve with our own suffering some sort of helpful role. It's nice to be able to say that it wasn't just a loss that I recovered from, but somehow a hidden benefit.
Just while we're